Welcome to the history section. Today, we're taking a look at the Norse settlement in the Western Isles, that whole geographic area that the Scandinavians knew as the Sudreyjar. It's a region that stretches really all the way from Lewis in the north down to the Isle of Man. And it was just fundamentally reshaped by centuries of Norwegian influence.
It absolutely was. And what we want to do is chart how these settlers establish not just a foothold, but a lasting cultural and political infrastructure.
And one that in some ways you can still see today.
That's right. So when we look at the initial settlements, the establishment of permanent ones, it was incredibly strategic. They stuck primarily to the islands along the western coast of Scotland.
And that choice, that preference for the islands, it wasn't random, was it?
No, not at all. It was dictated almost entirely by security. I mean, the islands gave them a critical defensive advantage against the land-based threat from the native inhabitants, the Gaels.
The Highlanders.
Exactly. You have to remember, during this period of Norse expansion, the sea was their domain. The Viking longship controlled the waterways.
So the Gaels on the mainland, they didn't really have the naval capability to launch an effective counterattack against an island stronghold.
Precisely. They generally avoided venturing too far onto the open sea, which made it very difficult to organize those kinds of sudden effective raids. So as a result, you get this kind of strategic safety gradient.
The further the island was from the mainland,
the more secure the Norwegian colony tended to be. And so over the 9th and 10th centuries, their presence just solidifies across this entire chain of islands. It creates this maritime empire facing west and south, connecting them to Ireland and the Irish Sea.
So once they've dominated the geography, they need a way to organize it, to name it, especially relative to their original homeland.
Yes, that's a key point. They needed an administrative framework, and they designated this entire archipelago, from the Orkneys all the way down to Man, as Sudreyjar.
Which means?
It's quite simple, really. It just means the Southern Islands. It's a name that's entirely relative to their main power bases in Orkney and Shetland, you see. The Sudreyjar were everything to the south of that.
And that term actually persists, doesn't it, in certain official titles?
It does, in the historical bishopric, for example. But, the definition wasn't always rigid. It was a bit fluid.
How so?
Well, in some of the sagas and administrative records, the Isle of Man is sometimes left out of that group. And when that happened, when Man was seen as its own entity, the rest of the islands were subdivided even further.
Right.
So the islands south of the Isle of Mull would then be called the Sudreyjar, the Southern Isles. And Mull itself, and every north of it, got the name Nordrøyar.
The Northern Isles.
The Northern Isles, a very logical geographical division from their perspective.
So that's the Norse internal system. What about the people who were already there? How did the Gaels refer to this new foreign power in their midst?
Well, they developed their own collective name for the territory. And it's a name that really reflects the reality of the conquest. They called the islands Innis Gaul,
which translates as
the Foreigners' Isles. And that designation is, I think, historically very potent. It immediately marks the Norse presence not as some kind of natural integration, but as an external conquering force.
A distinctly non-native power.
Exactly. So to really start charting the extent of this settlement, we should begin at the northern end of this domain, with the largest landmass in the Nordrøyar, Lewis and Harris. The sagas called it Lucius.
And it's a fascinating place to start because the island itself has this internal contrast that really explains the settlement patterns.
It does. It's separated from the mainland by the Minch, which is this broad, often very rough channel of water. So it has that maritime distance the Norse favored. But topographically, it's almost two different islands.
Harris in the south is very mountainous.
Very. Peaks between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. It makes large-scale settlement difficult, confining people mainly to the coast. But Lewis, the northern part, is quite different. It's much flatter, mostly moorland and heath.
And it was largely devoid of wood, which must have been a major challenge.
A huge resource scarcity they had to manage. But despite the difficult terrain, there were these pockets of arable land, particularly along the coasts, which allowed for farming and raising livestock.
And we know from the archaeology that this wasn't an empty land when they arrived.
Oh, absolutely not. The evidence shows a dense Gaelic population in very early times, long before the Norse. You just have to look at the huge stone rows and circles, like the complex near Callernish.
A sophisticated, established indigenous presence.
Yes, which means the Norse weren't just settling an empty frontier. They were layering their culture and their power on top of an existing ancient society.
And when we try to measure the scope of that layering, of that Norse activity, the study of place names is probably our most powerful tool.
It's the most incontestable evidence, I think. Political records can be biased or incomplete, but the landscape itself, it holds on to the language. The names tell us exactly where they settled, what they were doing there, their relationship with the land and the sea.
So if we focus on Lewis and Harris, the place names there are incredibly detailed, aren't they? It suggests they were establishing permanent homes, not just temporary raiding bases.
That's precisely what the evidence shows. I mean, look at the inland locks. So many of them still have the pure Norwegian ending vat, from vat, for water.
And not just one or two.
No, 3 of the largest locks on the island are all called Loch Langavat.
The long water.
The long water. It shows a deep familiarity, a permanent naming of crucial inland resources. And then you look at the coast, and it's almost entirely defined by Scandinavian terms.
Right, with different words for different types of features.
Exactly. They differentiate. You have inlets and coves using the term va, from vag, like Grosova. But then you also have wick, from vig, as in Sandwick. A vig was often a smaller, more specific anchorage. This distinction reveals a very specialized maritime culture that's all about finding safe harbors.
And beyond the water, the names also speak directly to how they use the land, their farming settlements. And this surely is the strongest linguistic proof of a fixed population.
It is, absolutely. We find a huge concentration of names ending in stra or sta. That comes from star or stead, meaning an established site, maybe a pasture. You see it in names like Arista and Magerhusta.
But the most telling one is boast.
Yes, from Bolstad, a farm or a settlement. And a bolstad wasn't just a hut. It meant an established agricultural holding, a farm with fields, animals, a settled family.
And you find a lot of these in Lewis.
A significant number, around 13. Names like Nessabost, Kalbost, Habost, Garabost. This concentration is absolute confirmation of extensive farming and fixed habitation.
Yeah.
It completely dispels that old idea that the Norse were only using the Hebrides for seasonal raids.
And then you have other names for key features like rivers.
Yes, like Laxey from Laxey, which means salmon river, or Tong from Tunga, a tongue of land. All of these names paint a picture of a settled agricultural economy.
What's interesting is that these names aren't just scattered evenly across the island. They seem to be clustered in specific areas.
They are. They're clustered around Loch Seaforth, and most densely of all, in that northernmost tip of Lewis, the district known simply as Ness.
And that can't be a coincidence.
No, the clustering in Ness suggests a very intense, maybe even a strategic colonization effort right there. The district even retains its pure Norwegian name Ness, meaning a naze or a promontory. It seems to have been a highly successful, very enduring Norse enclave.
So what does that persistence, both the geographical name and the linguistic density in Ness, tell us about how successful that particular colony was, especially compared to other parts of the island?
I think it suggests a remarkable degree of social cohesion. In Ness, almost all the specific features have Norse names. The lakes are Langavat and Steepavat. The valleys are Dibbedale and Iredale. And the settlements are Skigursta, Swainbost, Habost, Irapi.
And Irapi comes from Erebor.
The town on the Naze, yes. This kind of linguistic uniformity, centuries later, it points very strongly to a population that maintained its own language and social structure, defining itself against the Gaelic culture around it.
And this seems to have been backed up by, well, profound physical and cultural differences that people could still observe generations later.
This is one of the most remarkable sociological observations about the people of Ness. Even into the modern historical period, observers commented that the inhabitants there had noticeably different physical characteristics compared to the generally smaller, darker-featured Gaelic population elsewhere in Lewis and Harris.
How are they described?
They were consistently described as having lighter hair, being taller, with fairer features. They were often compared directly to Scandinavian physiognomies. It was apparently so striking that one observer wrote that you could feel you were in Scandinavia if it wasn't for the fact that they were speaking Gaelic.
Which they had eventually adopted.
Yes, for daily use, but spoken with a distinct accent, different from the southern parts of the island.
The idea that this kind of genetic and physical distinction could be kept up for centuries implies a very active resistance to mixing, doesn't it? It says a lot about their sense of identity.
It was rigorously maintained. The descendants of the Norwegians in Ness kept alive these active traditions of their origin. They traced their ancestry back to Lachlan, the Old Norse name for Norway.
And they saw themselves as having a better lineage than the Gaels.
They did. They considered themselves to have better descent. And crucially, they historically maintained a distinct, unmixed community. They actively avoided intermarrying with people from the southern, more Gaelic parts of the island.
So it was a self-imposed social boundary.
And that was instrumental in preserving those genetic and cultural markers. It wasn't just about survival. It was a deliberate, centuries-long rejection of assimilation.
Did this separation also show up in more practical things like their skills or even their clothing?
It did. It highlights the practical differences rooted in their heritage. There's documented evidence of a distinct traditional costume, which was completely different from the later Highland dress.
What did it look like?
Well, there's a description of an old man's preserved outfit. It was made of coarse brown wool. It had a close-fitting jacket sewn in one piece, and short trousers that only came down to just below the knee. It's a very utilitarian, very non-Gaelic kind of attire.
And what about their skills?
In terms of expertise, they were consistently said to be superior fishermen and sailors compared to the Gaels, who historically were often a bit more apprehensive about deep-sea travel. This maritime skill difference is very important.
Because it lends weight to certain historical records.
It does. There are records that note that men from Lewis were known to have harried Shetland. Now, given the Gaels' traditional avoidance of long sea voyages, it's highly unlikely they would have been involved in such distant raids.
So it had to be the Norse descendants from Ness.
It almost certainly was. They were continuing the maritime traditions of their ancestors. So this one specific enclave gives us this unique window into how a minority culture can be preserved through self-segregation and relying on specialized ancestral skills.
Now, if we move south from Lewis through the rest of the Nordreyar, does that pattern of place names continue to signal significant Scandinavian activity?
It does, but we start to see something else happening. We see more evidence of linguistic hybridization. It's a sign that the dominance of the Old Norse language was beginning to fade in favor of the very resilient Gaelic tongue.
Let's look at the outer islands then, particularly the Oias and the smaller islands nearby. What do we find there?
Even the small islands near Lewis and Harris have clear Norwegian names. That shows they controlled the entire maritime environment. You have Calvi from Kelfi, or Calf Island.
Pabay as well.
Pabay from Papi Priest Island. That often indicates the presence of early Irish monks, the Paper, who were there before the Norse, and Brunera from Jarnary Bear Island.
And moving south to the Uists,
Oh,
which the saga is called Ivist.
That's right. In Northwest, Benbecula, and Southwest, we find definite Norwegian traces, though maybe not as intensely concentrated. In Northwest, there's Kirkibost from Kirk Jubelstader.
Church farm.
Yes, indicating a settled Christian community. Benbecula has Norse-derived lake names like Loch Olivate and Langavat, and the coastal inlets, the Vaj, like Uskeva.
And there was a geological connection mentioned in the research for Southwest.
Indeed. South Uist has a mountain called Hekla. It's a name that was possibly brought over from the famous volcano in Iceland.
That's a fascinating piece of cultural memory.
It is. It suggests the settlers were carrying these geographical reference points with them from their homelands and applying them to their new environment. And other islands in that chain, like Grimsa, Bara, Eriske, they all have strong Scandinavian roots in their names.
The sheer geographical reach of their maritime control is just astounding. It goes even further west than the main island chain.
It does. And the extent of this maritime domain is really powerfully underlined by finds on the very remote island of St. Kilda, which is about 80 miles west of Lewis.
And what was found there?
2 peculiarly Scandinavian bowl-shaped brooches were discovered there. Now, that doesn't mean there was a mass settlement, but it confirms St. Kilda was firmly within the Norse sphere of influence and their trade routes. It suggests they had complete control of the western seaboard.
Let's turn our attention to Skye now, or Skid, as it was known, a large, very strategically important island. What kind of settlement patterns do we see there?
Skye's location. Separated from the mainland by that narrow sound, the Skitsund, it required very specific settlement strategies. It was often driven by defensive needs against the mainland Scots.
And the geography of the island itself played a big part in that.
A huge part. The western and northwestern parts of Skye have these deep firths and more fertile, sheltered land. The eastern coast, on the other hand, is less cultivable, and it's directly exposed to potential Gaelic attacks from the mainland.
So the Norwegians chose their spots carefully.
They did. They strategically settled on those more fertile, sheltered western firths and actively avoided the exposed eastern coast.
And the place names reflect that preference.
Clearly. The names are clustered in those sheltered zones. Near Loch Snizort, you find Skudabur, Skabost, and Braybost. Near Loch Bracadale, which the sagas called Vestrafjord.
Like a Western fur?
You find names like Fors and Orbost. Again, those both names confirming fixed agricultural holdings.
But the linguistic landscape in Skye seems different from that pure Norse enclave we saw in Ness. Here, you can really see the languages starting to blend.
That is a key insight. Skye shows clear signs of linguistic hybridization. You find these compound names like Giona Forcenary or Tunga Delabeg.
Where Gaelic terms are being added to Norwegian roots.
Exactly. Terms like beg, meaning little, or glen, are being attached to Norwegian roots like fors, a waterfall, or tunga, a tongue of land. This blending shows that Norse linguistic dominance was receding there. Gaelic was regaining preeminence and incorporating the Norse terms into its own structure.
So the Norse words survived, but within a Gaelic framework.
Yes, just as components. And this is probably why Skye became one of the most culturally resilient areas in the Highlands. Even with that Scandinavian overlay, the western districts of Skye are still one of the places where the Gaelic language and ancient traditions are strongest.
And moving further south again to Mull, how does that fit into the picture?
Mull is geographically important, but it's surprisingly less rich in obvious Norwegian memorials compared to Lewis or Skye. Still, there are key remnants. The ruins of the Palace of Arrows, which was the seat of the Lords of the Isles, gets its name from Arrows.
Meaning mouth of the rivulet.
That's right. And you see the linguistic hybrid again in the River Glen Forsay, which combines the Gaelic Glen with the Norwegian Forsay.
The smaller islands to the west of Mull seem to have a heavier concentration of Norse names.
They do. Islands like Colin Tyree have many names ending in bol or pole, from Bolsterber, Crosspole, Arnabost, Kirkapole. And of course, Staffa, which is famous for its basalt caverns, gets its name from the Norse Stafi.
Staff Island.
A very fitting description of its structure. And that really concludes the survey of the Nordrear, showing this pattern of intense colonization in the north, which gives way to more of a political and linguistic blending as you move south.
And in the middle of all this, you have the small island of Iona, or Icolmkill, which holds this unique and really pivotal position in the history of the region.
It does. It's a key junction. It's the physical place where the pre-existing Celtic Christian world first collided violently with, and then later partially merged with, the arriving Scandinavian culture. It's small, it doesn't have massive ruins, but its religious sanctity was hugely influential.
And that sanctity comes from its role as the critical point for the spread of Christianity into Scotland and the islands after St. Columba settled there.
That sanctity gave Iona its reputation across the entire North Atlantic world. And because of that fame, tradition held that it was the chosen burial place for ancient Irish and Scottish kings, and notably for Norwegian kings and mighty men.
And there's a record of that, isn't there?
Yes, Dean Monroe, writing in 1594, specifically noted an inscription he saw there that read, Tumulus Regum Norwegii.
The tomb of the kings of Norway.
Exactly. But we have to be very precise about who these kings of Norway were.
They weren't the monarchs from mainland Norway.
No, that's a vital clarification. These were the regional rulers, the kings of the Sudreyjar and the various Irish kings of Norwegian descent, especially those from the Viking kingdom of Dublin. It's plausible they would want to be buried at Iona, as it was the chief church for the bishops of the Isles.
This brings us to a major paradox, though. Iona was a Christian holy site, but the early Norwegians were heathen Vikings, famous for plundering monasteries.
The interaction was very complex, and it shifted dramatically over time as the Norse themselves converted. In the early Viking Age, when they were still heathen, Iona was repeatedly attacked and plundered. Its wealth made it a prime target.
But at the same time, it was also key to their eventual conversion.
Yes, it was vital for disseminating Christianity among the Norwegians who settled in the Sudreyjar, the Orkneys, and Shetland. And that influence wasn't just local. From these new Christianized Norse communities, the faith was then carried further, back to Norway itself and to Iceland.
So Iona acted as a cultural nexus that actually reversed the flow of faith back into the Scandinavian homelands.
It did. And we have a definitive historical moment that illustrates that transition, from heathen plunderer to a Christian ruler who respected Iona's sanctity.
And that involves King Magnus Barfod.
It does. History tells us that once Christianity took hold in the Norse communities, Iona was given genuine respect. During Magnus Barfod's expedition in 1097, he visited Iron Helga, the Holy Island.
And the saga is very specific about what happened.
Very specific. It notes that he guaranteed peace to the inhabitants and personally respected its sanctity. He went into the small church there, but instead of plundering it, he immediately locked the door again and declared that no one should ever dare to enter it.
He essentially turned it into a protected relic.
He did. And that action marks this clear, powerful transition in the Norse view of Iona. It went from being a valuable target to a venerated symbol.
So as we move fully into the territory defined as the Sudrajar, south of Mull, the nature of the evidence starts to shift. We see less emphasis on that kind of pervasive demographic settlement we saw in Ness, and more on centers of organized Norwegian rule.
That's a good way to put it. The boundary was, as we said, fluid, but the stronghold of Cairnburg or Björneborg in the sagas near Mull often served as that dividing line. The Sudrajar, which included islands like Islay and the peninsula of Cantyre, were strategically very valuable.
Because they were more fertile.
More fertile, a better climate, and more protected. But Cairnburg itself was a crucial fortress, almost always garrisoned and frequently fought over because of its proximity to the mainland.
It's interesting, though, that the islands that are geographically closest to the Scottish mainland, like Aran and Bute, they actually show very little evidence of a permanently settled Norwegian population.
And that proximity is the explanation. They were just a bit too near the hostile Scottish coasts and too far from the major Norwegian population centers like Man and Islay. It would have been very difficult for Norwegian farmers to hold on against sustained Gaelic pressure.
So the Norse influence there was more political and military than demographic.
Exactly. It was a claim on territory, not a population shift. In fact, the Norwegian name for the Cumber Isles, Cumrayr, suggests that the Simri, or Gaels, were always the main inhabitants there.
But by contrast, the peninsula of Cantyre and the island of Islay show really strong evidence of significant colonization and political importance.
Cantyre, or Satiri, certainly did. You see it in the names. Smurbies, Killipol, Torresdale, and the purely Norwegian Skipness. And the peninsula's narrow isthmus, Satirisaid, which is now Tarbay.
Meaning a place to drag birds over.
That's right. It was the site of that highly symbolic act by King Magnus Barfod during his expedition.
The event that captures the political cunning of the Norse rulers.
Yes. The treaty he made with the Scottish king stipulated that any island Magnus could reach with a sailing vessel would belong to Norway. So Magnus had his ship hauled over that narrow strip of land. He sat at the helm the whole time, effectively sailing it over the land.
And by doing so, he legally claimed the entire peninsula as an island under the treaty's terms.
It was both literal and politically brilliant. It really showcases that opportunistic, legalistic mindset that often went along with their military conquests.
And then there's Islay.
Islay, or Ill in the sagas, was highly prized. It was described as fruitful and rich. And it still has strong Norwegian traces, like the River Laxey, the Salmon River. And consistent with the needs of a ruling class, the Norwegian names are concentrated in the center and west of the island, further from the mainland threat.
So places like Nørby and Conisby.
Exactly. That density confirms that the kings and jarls of the Sudrajar had their main residences on Islay, relying on the concentrated loyalty of their Norse countrymen for their power base.
But the ultimate center of this whole dominion lay even further south, on the Isle of Man.
Man or Mun, yes. Its location, midway between Cumberland and Ireland, made it the undeniable chief seat of Norwegian power in the Irish Sea. And although the modern language is Manx, a Gaelic dialect, the island has the most incontestable proof of a widespread, dominant Scandinavian population.
Even the highest mountain has a Norse name.
Snæfell, from Snæshield Snow Mountain. The east coast has Laxey, the Salmon River, and the long promontory of Langness. Derby Haven was known to them as Rodvaldsvagar, which is where the name Roddelsway comes from.
And you mentioned earlier a crucial linguistic difference in the settlement names on Man compared to the Northern Islands, which suggests something about where the settlers came from.
That difference is highly significant. Man has a large number of place names ending in by, Colby, Kirby, Sulby. This is in stark contrast to the Northern Islands, where both names ending in bost were the norm.
And by is more characteristic of Danish settlement patterns.
Yes, Danish and Anglian patterns that you see in northern England. It strongly suggests that a portion of the colonization of Man might have come from the neighboring old Danish region of Cumberland. This likely resulted in a mixed Norwegian-Danish population forming the ruling class on the island.
So let's talk about the most unique and really the most durable physical evidence of this Norse predominance, which is found on the Isle of Man itself, the runic stones.
Yes. The island has about 30 of these ancient sculptured monuments, these sepulchral crosses, and critically, at least 13 of them have genuine Scandinavian runic inscriptions. This is something you just don't find in contemporary England and Scotland. They are an invaluable window into that Manx Norse community.
And where on the island do we find them? Does their location tell us anything?
It tells us a great deal. They aren't scattered randomly. They are found exclusively in the northern half of the island, in churchyards like Kirk Andreas, Kirk Michael, and Kirk Bradden.
Which suggests.
It suggests with a high degree of probability that the Scandinavian language and culture were most dominant in the northern part of the island when these stones were being made, which was mostly in the 11th century.
A peak period of their cultural confidence just before or during the later phases of their rule?
Exactly. And the inscriptions themselves, the language is pure Scandinavian.
Huh.
The personal names are demonstrably Norse. Thorlof, Arnbjörg, Frida. And what's more, they often use these compound names to distinguish people, like Sandulf the Swarthy or Thorolf the Red.
A genuine Scandinavian tradition.
Very much so. It suggests a society that's highly visual and very self-aware.
Could you give us an example of one of these inscriptions?
Certainly. A well-preserved one at Kirk Bradden reads, Thorlabranaki risti krus dena amatas fiax, Brutherson Jabs, which is, Thorlafniki erected this cross to Fiak, brother, a son of Job. It's a family dedication, marking the lineage.
And there's another one dedicated by a husband to his wife.
Yes, at Andreas churchyard. Sandulf ein Swarti reisti krus dena after Arin Björg Quinusina. That's Sandulf the Swarthy erected this cross to his wife Arnbjörg. These inscriptions confirm clear Norse lineage, complex family structures, and a real desire for public commemoration.
But the stones also show us that despite this Norse dominance, there was active cultural interaction with the native Gaelic population.
This is where they become profoundly significant. While most of the names are Scandinavian, you see names like Neki, Fichek, and Job, which suggests some mingling was already happening.
And there's one stone that provides undeniable proof of deep cross-cultural ties.
There is at Kirk Michael. The inscription features purely Gaelic names, Mallunkun and Malmuru, but they are carved entirely in Norwegian runes.
So a Gaelic dedication using the Norse script.
And it reads, Mallunkun reisti krustana eftir Malmuru fustrasin. Mallunkun erected this cross to his foster father Malmor. It documents a fostering bond, which is a profound relationship in Celtic tradition, being commemorated using the script and monumental style of the conquering Norse. It completely dissolves any simple us versus them narrative.
What's also remarkable is that the stones give us a glimpse of the artists themselves, showing a very sophisticated level of artistic culture among the settlers.
It's extraordinary that we can identify the craftsman. An inscription on a cross at Kirk Michael explicitly names the carver. After the main dedication, it says, Gaut Björnsön och alla iman.
Gaut made this cross an all-on man.
It's a powerful declaration of artistic dominance. And this ambitious claim was actually substantiated.
How so?
A damaged fragment found near Kirk Andreas confirms his full name and lineage. In Gautregyrthi, center of Bjarnar. Gaut Björnsön made it.
So Gaut, the son of Bjorn, was likely the dominant, maybe even the only, specialized carver of these monuments during that period.
It certainly points towards an institutionalized level of craftsmanship, maybe even a monopoly on the funerary art market. And he was clearly an expert who was culturally adaptive. The shape of the crosses imitates Scottish models, showing that cultural exchange. But he injects these characteristic Scandinavian elements like the scale-covered serpents, which are very distinct.
And the prevalence of the Christian cross and mentions of Jesus Christ confirm that the Norse community had fully adopted the new faith by this time.
Undeniably. The institutional adoption of the faith was complete. Historical records detail several bishops in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries who were clearly of Norwegian descent, like Rulwer and Reginald. It shows the complete institutionalization of Christianity within the Norse ruling class.
So let's turn to the political history, which is one of continuous conflict and complex successions, with these regional kings trying to balance their tributary status to Norway with their own power bases.
That's right. The tradition holds that Harald Haarfagr appointed a Jarl in Man back in the 9th century. After that, you have a succession of local Norse kings, Godred, Reginald, Olav, who ruled as tributaries to the Norwegian crown, but also had very close ties to the Scandinavian kings of Dublin.
But that status quo was shattered in 1077?
It was, by a figure named Godred Crovan, who conquered Man at the battle near Skyhill. He then declared independence from Norway and went on to conquer Dublin and Leinster, establishing this powerful, independent Norse Gaelic kingdom centered on Man.
Which, of course, prompted a major response from mainland Norway, led by King Magnus Barfod.
It did. Around 1097, Magnus launched a huge expedition to reassert Norwegian supremacy. He campaigned all along the west coast of Scotland and through the Sudrejar.
And that campaign led to the famous story about Cantyre.
Yes, and the legal framework for it came from his treaty with the Scottish king. As we discussed, his claim to the peninsula was based on that clever, legalistic interpretation of sailing his ship over the isthmus.
And the expedition also had a lasting impact on fashion, strangely enough.
It did. When Magnus returned to Norway, he adopted the short coats and cloaks of the Western Isles, and he and his men went about with bare legs. This earned him the nickname Barfud, or bare legs. And the record of this is actually the oldest extant account we have of the Highland dress.
So following this reassertion of power, the bishoprics of Man and the Sudrejar were formally unified and placed under the authority of the Archbishopric of Trondheim in Norway.
Yes, and that institutional link lasted from 1181 until 1334, confirming that long-term Norwegian authority.
But political control then fragmented again in the mid-12th century with the rise of Sommerlund.
Jarl Sommerlund, who had significant Norwegian ancestry himself, emerged as this powerful indigenous challenger. After a decisive naval battle in 1156, he forced the Manx king to give up control of all the Sudrejar from Mull southwards.
And this is the origin of the Lords of the Isles.
It is. Sommerlund established the lineage that would become that powerful, semi-independent dynasty. Godred Crovan's descendants managed to hold on to Man and often the Northern Islands, but their overall power was greatly reduced.
All this maneuvering between the Norse rulers and the Scottish crown eventually culminates in that final, massive Norwegian military expedition in the 13th century.
Yes, the Scottish kings, especially Alexander III, were determined to expel the Norwegians for good. Their constant pressure led directly to the last great Norse military response, the huge expedition of King Håkon Håkonsson in 1263.
He assembled a massive fleet.
Around 200 ships, which he gathered at the island of Carrera. He was joined by his key regional allies, Malmö King Magnus and King Dougal from the Sudrejar.
And his campaign used classic Viking stratagem.
It did. Part of the fleet sailed up Loch Long, and they hauled their ships over the Tarbis Strip into Loch Lomond to raid deep into the Scottish district of Lennox, trying to draw forces away from the coast.
But the Scottish defense, combined with some bad weather, led to the final pivotal conflict at the Battle of Largs.
That's right. Hakon's main fleet was anchored under Cumbria Island in the Firth of Clyde, opposite Largs. And at this critical moment, a furious storm hit them. It was so violent the Norwegians believed it had been summoned by witchcraft.
And the storm drove their ships ashore.
Several of them, forcing the crews to beach and defend their vessels. The Scots, who had a large army nearby, saw their chance and immediately attacked the stranded crews.
And that was the Battle of Largs on October 3rd, 1263.
Yes. The Norwegians, hampered by the storm, unable to use their naval superiority, were overpowered by the Scottish army. It was a decisive military and psychological defeat.
Effectively sealing the fate of Norwegian political control.
It was. King Håkon retreated to the Orkneys, where he died that December. The momentum was completely lost. His successor, Magnus Håkonsson, realized that holding on to such a distant dominion was no longer viable.
So he negotiated a treaty.
In 1266, he formally ceded all Norwegian rights over the Sudrejar and Man to the Scottish crown for 4,000 marks sterling and a yearly tribute. The era of direct Norwegian rule officially ended a few years later, in 1270, when the Scots defeated the last pocket of resistance on the Isle of Man.
So the Battle of Largs ends direct Norwegian political control, but it certainly doesn't erase the Norwegian presence. In fact, some of common stories about a mass slaughter of the settlers are strongly refuted by what we see happening next.
That's right. The tradition, sometimes told by the Gaels, of a coordinated murder of their Norwegian guests, that chilling phrase from Lewis, Marbod gash, then Abwana, everyone shall kill his guest. It's fundamentally challenged by the continuity of the ruling class.
Because the Lords of the Isles who came after Sommerlund were themselves largely of Norwegian extraction.
Exactly. They maintained their power, often in defiance of the Scottish crown, right up until the 16th century. There was no mass extermination of the elite. There was assimilation and the continuation of those Norse bloodlines.
And you can see this woven directly into the ancestry of several prominent Highland clans.
You can. Many clans assert their Scandinavian bloodline. Clan Ranald gets its name from Reginald, or Ragmald. Clan Dougal comes from Dubgal, the Dark Strangers, a Gaelic name for the Danes. Both are linked directly to Sommerled's lineage.
And the MacLeods and Skye still use pure Norwegian names.
They do. Torkil and Tormod are still used among their chiefs, a deliberate preservation of ancestral Norse names. And even near Largs itself, a silver gilt brooch was found with a runic inscription. Melbrid owns this brooch, a Gaelic name, Melbrid, written in Scandinavian script. It confirms that continued assimilated presence.
But perhaps the most tangible and I think the most unique Norwegian legacy survives not in the Hebrides, but in the constitutional structure of the Isle of Man.
The political endurance of man is just exceptional. It's a testament to the organizational capacity of the Norse settlers. It has uninterruptedly kept its status as a self-governing entity with an originally Scandinavian constitution, even after it passed to the English crown.
And their annual assemblies are still held on the Tynwald Hill.
The Tynwald Hill, from Tynwald or Pingaville, it is the only surviving functional example of the ancient Scandinavian thing hills outside of the Nordic countries.
And the structure of the Manx parliament, with its 3 estates, also dates back to this period.
It does. You have the lord or king, the governor and council, and the 24 representatives, the keys. And a law isn't valid until it's been proclaimed from the Tynwald Hill itself.
The composition of the House of Keys is also very revealing about the nature of the Norse conquest.
Extremely revealing. Historically, the representatives were self-appointing and held their seats for life. This aristocratic mode of operation perfectly reflects that period of conquest where the Norse settlers established themselves as a dominant lord class over the native population. Power was maintained within their own ranks.
Tell us about the hill itself and the ceremony.
It's an artificial structure near Peel, supposedly raised with earth from all 17 parishes of the island, unifying the territory. It has 4 distinct terraces, and once a year, on St. John the Baptist's Day, the court processes to the hill and proclaims all new laws in both English and Manx.
It's a remarkable survival.
It is. This constitutional structure, created by conquering Norsemen over 9 centuries ago, was so stable and self-sustaining that it survived geopolitical changes, transfers of crowns, everything. The Isle of Man is this unintentional laboratory for the survival of Viking Age political practice.
Considering those deep constitutional roots in the Tynwald system, we are left to ponder whether we should look to these ancient Norse settlements not just as places of conquest, but as these unintended laboratories for the transmission and survival of sophisticated constitutional governance.
It really forces us to redefine what a legacy truly means. It moves beyond just runic inscriptions and place names to encompass the actual architecture of law and self-rule.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available on this channel. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.
While this is an AI recording, the research that has gone into this production is comprehensive and focuses on very specific moments in history, designed to bring as much detail to the listener as possible. Thanks again for listening in.